I finally figured out which vertical planter I'm going to put in this corner of my backyard. My plan is to fill it with strawberries since my family eats so many strawberries. I've spent the last 2 days reading every web page and watching every YouTube video and reading every Instagram complaint or Facebook complaint from the Garden Tower 2 and the Greenstalk vertical planter. Those are the two primary vertical planters that we're going to be comparing today. If you're in the market for a vertical planter, you don't want to miss this. I'm going to be sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly. Hey guys, my name's Jen. I'm here in Melbourne, Florida. Melbourne is in Central Florida on the East Coast, right near Cape Canaveral, and it's Zone 10A for gardening. 2 years ago, I quit my engineering career to become a stay-at-home mom, and somehow during that process, I got totally addicted to backyard gardening. My mission here at the channel is to share some information to help you keep going on your growing journey and maybe share some of my lessons learned along the way. First, let's talk about why you might want to choose a vertical planter. A vertical planter is a system that basically has pockets for you to put several different plants or multiples of the same plant if you choose, but it allows you to grow in an upwards direction instead of like a raised bed that takes up a big footprint on the ground. So this is helpful for somebody with a small backyard, or maybe you want to maintain the use of your backyard for other things, or somebody who has a balcony and wants to grow on a balcony. Now the two best on the market that I can see are the Garden Tower 2 and the Greenstalk vertical planter. Now it seems to me that the Greenstalk vertical planter is much more popular. I see Instagram posts, I see YouTube videos all about the Greenstalk vertical planter. But then I came across the Garden Tower 2 that actually has some really cool features, and I think it's worth a second look. So let's dive in. I'll compare several categories like the price, the size, the number of pockets, and then we're going to talk about how you would use and maintain those two different vertical planters. It might surprise you, but the maintenance on both of them is pretty drastically different. Now I want you to know this is not a sponsored video. I don't get payment from Greenstalk and I don't get payment from Garden Tower Project. I'm simply a backyard gardener who's trying to figure out the best vertical planter to buy for my space. After I post this video, I will be buying one and I'll let you guess which one I'm buying. Let's start first by talking through the Greenstalk vertical planter. The Greenstalk vertical planter has two varieties. One is called the original and one is called the leaf. The original stands 55 inches tall and the leaf stands 56 inches tall. So they're pretty similar, although the original has 5 tiers and the leaf has 7 tiers. So this means the original planter has deeper layers and is meant for some bigger plants. When you go to greenstalk.com, the original is a 5-tier system with a water reservoir on top, and the leaf is a 7-tier system with a water reservoir on top. The original has 30 pockets for plants, and the leaf has 42 pockets for plants. For me, since I'm considering strawberries, Greenstalk actually has a PDF on their website about which planter is best for which crop, and they recommend the leaf for the strawberries. So that's the one that I would probably choose between the original and the leaf. Now the way the Greenstalk vertical planter works is there's different tiers. They're basically containers, like a solid container that holds about 1 cubic foot of soil, and then you stack those containers on top of each other and there's a water reservoir on top. In between each layer is this gray bin that is used to distribute the water. So they have a unique watering system where you fill up the top reservoir with water and it drips through the center column out into these little discs, these gray discs that are in between each container. And those gray discs have some small holes in them that drips the water very slowly into those tiers. It says online that that water reservoir would empty in about 5 minutes all throughout the planter. So this integrated watering system can help ease the watering of this tower. So instead of having to water each tray individually, you're only going to be putting water up in the top reservoir. One of the common complaints is that the holes on the gray discs actually clog up with soil, and then you may get one tier that's completely dry. Some different YouTubers recommend drilling out the hole to make it larger to avoid that, but Greenstalk recommends against that actually. Another method would be to continuously check, probably with your finger or something, to see if that hole is clogged or not. Another common issue is you may have one side of the Greenstalk getting watered and one side being kind of dry, and most of the time this is caused by people not setting it up on level ground or making sure the tiers are level with each other. So they recommend actually putting like a big paver down and paver sand underneath to make sure you've got a level surface to put your planter on. And then as you stack each one, make sure there's nothing getting in the way causing the different containers to be a little cockeyed. Now when you're setting up the Greenstalk vertical planter, what you're going to do is take each one of those tiers, fill it up with potting mix. Make sure it's potting mix and not like garden soil or something. It has to be potting mix to have the correct amount of drainage. You're probably going to want to choose a potting mix that's rich in nutrients, something that says on the label that it will feed plants for 2 to 3 months. Once you get one container full of soil, that's your base. And then you'll put the gray watering disc on top, and then you'll put an additional layer full of soil on top of that. Now, as you might imagine, when you stack this whole tower up, it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to reach in there if you ever needed to like amend the soil, right? When we're talking about raised bed gardening or container gardening, we always need to be able to amend the soil, because we all know that as plants grow, they consume the nutrients in the soil, and then that soil level will shrink. And you need to be providing the plants with food. What I found interesting on the Greenstalk website is as I was thinking through this, I was thinking how difficult it would be to add compost or add plant food into each layer without disassembling the whole thing through the planting season, right? So they actually recommend using a liquid fertilizer and using their watering system to distribute it. So you could mix in something like the Fox Farm Big Bloom fertilizer into the water reservoir, and it'll distribute it through the soil and continue to feed your plants after that initial 2 months of feeding that you'll get from your fresh potting mix. Now, doing the liquid fertilizer a few times through the season will help your plants a lot, but once it comes time to pull those plants and get new ones in there, you're looking at a situation where you're gonna need to disassemble the Greenstalk and amend the soil with compost or fertilizer, then put it back together. So each of these tiers is going to weigh almost about 23 or 25 pounds. So consider that when you're trying to decide which vertical planter to buy. Another thing we need to consider with vertical planters in general is that because this is a vertical planter, you're potentially going to be shading one side of the planter all the time because the sun's not going to be perfectly overhead, right? So we always want the ability to spin the planter. We're probably either going to want to spin it once a day or put shade-loving leafy greens on one side and more sun-loving plants on the other side. They offer the ultimate spinner for about $40. It's something that you put on the very bottom and then you stack the tiers on top, and that gives you the ability to spin it. One word of caution though, there is an automatic watering system that they offer where you can connect your outdoor garden hose to their adapters and poly tubing that runs up the side of the vertical planter and fills the reservoir up top. But if you have that set up, you can no longer rotate your planter. Now the Greenstalk vertical planters are made of food grade plastic, just like the Garden Tower 2. They even offer these additional plant supports on the side that are, it's just kind of like a ring that sits on the outside of the Garden Tower. So if you wanted to grow something larger like tomatoes or peppers or something that are falling over the edge, those plant supports will help. Whereas in the Garden Tower 2, you're gonna have to manually put like a bamboo stake or something in it. Both the Garden Tower 2 and the Greenstalk vertical planter offer wheels for purchase so that you can put them on the bottom of the tower and move it around in your yard. Now let's talk about how the Greenstalk vertical planter drains. If you were to overwater, for example, any excess water will come out a spout at the very bottom and just drain into your yard or onto your patio. And so this is what prohibits them from suggesting that you use the Greenstalk vertical planter indoors. So as of right now, they say don't use the Greenstalk vertical planter indoors. Yes, you could probably rig up some way to catch that water and not make a mess in your floor and rig up some grow lights if you really wanted to, but right now they don't do that. The Greenstalk vertical planters are made in the state of Tennessee in the USA, and they have a 5-year warranty on cracks and fading. So let's recap what you get with a Greenstalk vertical planter. It's essentially 5 or 7 containers that have a special watering system that allow you to slowly drip water into all of those containers and grow in a vertical direction. Now let's talk about the Garden Tower 2. Don't worry, I know I haven't talked about price yet, but we're going to talk about price at the very end and compare the price of all three products. Now, when I first looked at the Garden Tower 2, I assumed it was the same thing, just layered containers in a slightly different shape to accomplish the same thing. But boy, was I wrong. The Garden Tower 2 is somewhat similar in the sense that it has pockets for your plants and it grows in a vertical direction. However, instead of separate containers, you're basically creating a soil tower. So there's these outer walls that have the pockets for the plants, and then there's this center that's a vermicompost tower. I'll get into that in a minute. But what you do when you set up is you have your base, and then you put your first layer of your pockets, and then your first layer of your vermicompost tower, and you fill soil in all around that. Then you do the same thing with a second layer, and the vermicompost tower, and then you fill that up with soil. However, there's no bottom to these layers, so that soil is, the second layer of soil is literally just on top of your first layer of soil. And you keep on going up the tower, up to the full height of the tower. And in the end, what you have is, imagine an inner cylinder for compost, soil surrounding that, and then these walls on the outside with pockets for your different plants. Now let's talk about how a column of soil could be very different in terms of maintenance from 5 different containers of soil. To me, it actually would probably make it so much easier because when it comes time to amend the soil, all you're going to be doing is top dressing that top portion of the column. Instead of taking out each container and amending each one and putting it back together, it can be a little bit simpler and you just put the amendments on the very top of the column, but also realistically, you're probably going to want to add some fertilizer into each one of those plant pockets too. Now, Garden Tower 2 does not have an integrated watering system at the moment, even though I can see on their website that they were offering some beta testing for an automated watering system. Right now, it's not integrated in the whole thing, so as of right now, if you were to buy that, you're going to be hand watering or setting up your own DIY drip system. So what that means for fertilizer is you're probably not going to be choosing a liquid fertilizer in the same way that you would on a Greenstalk vertical planter. But now let's talk about that vermicompost center, because maybe you don't even need the liquid fertilizer. So if you haven't heard of vermicomposting, it's composting done with worms. Instead of letting the heat and the sun warm up and break down your compost pile, it's actually worms that are feeding on that and then distributing their castings throughout the soil in the entire garden tower. Now they have some pretty specific instructions on how to do the vermicomposting. Essentially, you're gonna do 1 handful of greens, so like 1 handful of kitchen scraps to like 3 to 4 handfuls of browns. Browns would be like shredded cardboard or dried leaves or twigs and stuff like that. So 1 handful of greens to 3 to 4 handfuls of browns. And you're gonna do that in layers into the column. Once you get that started in your garden tower, what you're gonna do is drop in, they say about 500 red wiggler worms that you can buy online. I'll put a link in the description box below to where they recommend to buy it from. And then about 5 night crawlers, which is a different type of worm. So the red wigglers will break down that compost in the center tower, and then the night crawlers do a little bit better job at aerating the soil and spreading the nutrients throughout the soil. Now another interesting thing that they do with the vermicompost tower is there's basically a gate, they call it, at the bottom, and then a drawer at the bottom. So they say once a month you need to be pulling that gate out and pushing down the compost pile to remove some compost out with a drawer. The reason you're going to want to do that is because this vermicompost tower in the center of the garden tower has perforated holes throughout the whole thing, and plant roots will grow into the nutrients directly. But we don't want it to become root bound into this compost column, so you're going to want to push that down every 30 days and pull compost out the bottom. You can use that compost in any raised bed, or you can just amend the soil right on top of the garden tower itself. Now let's talk about drainage. Remember when we were talking about the Greenstalk vertical planter and I said that any excess water just drains out a port on the bottom of the planter? It's a little bit different in the garden tower too. In the garden tower too, all of that excess water drains into a drawer at the very bottom of the planter. So it's collected. And as it goes through the tower, it'll also go through some of the compost as well, and you'll get what's called a compost tea. So what you're going to do after every watering is to pull out that drawer, and whatever nutrient dense water is in there, you're just going to pour it back on top of the tower, and it's going to be like a second pass for the nutrients for your veggies. Now the Garden Tower 2 is a little bit shorter than the Greenstalk. It sits at about 43 inches high, so maybe that's something that you're interested in if you know, you're thinking about maybe your kids using it, or maybe you're pretty short like me. I'm only like 5'2". The width of the Greenstalk is about 19 inches, and the width of the Garden Tower 2 is about 24.5 inches wide. So it does take up a larger footprint. The pocket count on the Garden Tower 2 is 50, but the Greenstalk vertical planter, the original, has 30 and the leaf has 42. The Garden Tower 2 has a 5-year warranty and is made in the USA as well, in Indiana. The soil capacity, you're looking at about 6 cubic feet of soil to fill a Garden Tower 2. And I have not seen them offer any plant supports. What I've seen are people adding bamboo stakes or some other stake or trellis. Now, if you're trying to use a vertical planter indoors, they do actually say the Garden Tower 2 can be used indoors. And I believe that's just because they control the drainage so it's not leaking straight out the bottom, where like the Greenstalk vertical planter. Of course, if you chose to do this inside, you're going to need some grow lights. Similar to the Greenstalk vertical planter, the type of soil you use matters. What you're going to choose is a potting mix for proper drainage, not a raised bed garden soil. Now, the most common complaint I've seen with the Garden Tower 2 is in relation to the Vermicompost Tower. It seems like a lot of people are going through a learning curve to get the right balance of materials so they don't have a situation where it's too wet or it's not breaking down. But what they recommend is 1 handful of greens to 3 to 4 handfuls of browns, and then also pushing it down once a month. So if you're willing to go through a learning curve to figure out how to do vermicomposting correctly, it seems like this could be really beneficial, because you're just creating this environment where, number one, you're more sustainable with your own kitchen food scraps, right? And number two, your soil is constantly being revitalized with nutrients, whereas on something like the Greenstalk vertical garden, it's up to you to manually amend or fertilize. Now that we've talked through all the features at length, let's talk about the pricing. Now I want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. So what we're going to compare is the Garden Tower 2 to the Greenstalk original 5-tier planter with the ultimate spinner, and the Greenstalk vertical leaf planter with the ultimate spinner. The Garden Tower 2 comes in at $499, although right now it is marked down to $379. The original Greenstalk vertical planter with the ultimate spinner is $189. That's $149 for the planter itself, and then another $40 for the spinner. Now the Greenstalk leaf planter is about $209, which is $169 for the planter and $40 for the spinner. Now I know I said earlier that the most common complaint about the Garden Tower was issues with the Vermicompost Tower, but I gotta say, the by far biggest complaint about it is the price. And it is drastically higher than the Greenstalk. There is no denying that. So to some people it may be worth it because it has the Vermicompost Tower and it gives them a spot to compost some food without having a separate compost area. But to some people it may not be. Now I would love to hear your thoughts on whether that higher price is worth it because of the vermicompost capability or not. Let's hear it in the comments below. So I know I've made my decision about which one I'm gonna buy, and I will reveal it in October when I start planting strawberries. Be sure to subscribe and like this video so you can find out which one I bought.